Thank you, Ross, and thank you for inviting me to facilitate this evening's discussion. As Ross mentioned, I've been based at SafeGround for 7 or so years, and SafeGround is a member organisation of IPAN as well. And obviously the work that I do on autonomous weapons is obviously very closely linked to this question of defence policy, what Australia's defence policy should look like and what it should involve. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have, as Ross mentioned, on this idea of the political adjustments that might be involved for our alliances in order to implement an independent foreign policy in Australia. And so I suppose, as a little bit more background, the current Australian defence policy is based on the alliance that we have with the United States, or some might say reliance. I'm getting a bit of feedback there. I'll just pause for a moment. That's better. And so this relationship that Australia has with the US has drawn Australia into various wars. It also has implications for how we conduct foreign policy and make an array of different decisions for our country. And
where's the sound gone?
And Bevan has joined the meeting alert.
hello, have I been muted?
Yes.
Have I been muted the whole time?
No, just the last little bit.
Okay, excellent. So I was just saying that it's a timely point to have this discussion as well, with the Defence Strategic Review currently underway and also open for public submissions about what Australia's defence policy should look like moving forward. That's all that I'm going to say for now, however, because we have two speakers that are both going to present, and after that we'll have time for a Q&A. So for our first speaker, I would like to introduce Dr. Alison Broinowski, who is the President of the Australian for War Powers Reform. Alison is also a former Australian diplomat, having lived and worked in Japan, Burma, Iran, the Philippines, South Korea, Jordan, Mexico, and New York at the United Nations headquarters. She's the author or editor of 14 books about Australia's dealings with the world and Asian countries in particular. Best known for The Yellow Lady, Australia's Impression of Asia, and also Howard's War, and Allied and Addicted. And so her PhD was in Asian Studies at ANU, where she researched and taught, also at Macquarie University and the University of Wollongong. And so she's been long been a member of the Australian Republic movement and of the Australian War Powers Reform. She is also a board member of World Beyond War, based in the United States. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Alison to hear from her on this evening's topic.
Thank you, Matilda, and thanks everyone for being here. Here we all are again, and we're still facing the worst, probably worse threats than we have for years and years and years. What we now need to be thinking about, and we in Australians War Powers Reform have been talking for a long time about the way we go to war. But I suggest to this group today, who are all familiar with that we need to think about why we go to war. And that's what I'd like people to concentrate on in trying to stop us doing something even worse than we have done before. What we have at the moment are a couple of really good opportunities to do that. Not only has IPAN done this terrific survey over the last 2 years and took a long time to do it and get it all together and make sure it was right instead of rushing the thing. What IPAN has done is got together something that in November, next month, is going to make a real difference in people's understanding about not only how, but also why we go to war and why this is not something that we ought to go on doing. So it's fantastic that Annette and her colleagues have done this wonderful work for years and haven't stopped because, of course, we haven't got there yet. So I'm looking forward to that event in November. I think it's going to make a huge impact. And what it does, if I may say so, is reflect the views of Australians who are not in politics, the views of Australians all over the place. I mean, the people who submitted their views to IPAN were from every possible walk of life. And these are the people who vote. And what we are trying to do is get politicians to understand that while they may have their own agendas between this and that faction or this and that party, they actually represent the people, and the people have made their voice heard to us through IPAN. So this is really important. Now, what's going on right now is something that my organization, Australians for War Powers Reform, has been struggling for 10 years. Can you believe it? 10 years has taken us to get to here, to actually get an inquiry up. Now, we were, of course, delighted to hear that that had happened, because some of us were just about to give it up, you know? My friend, Michael Kirby, QC, says, don't give up. I say that to all of us, don't give up. He's right, we didn't. And on that very day that we were about to give up, I got a phone call from Josh Wilson, ALP in Perth, saying, hey, we've got the inquiry up. And of course, I was so delighted, and so were all my members, and so was everybody, until we started to think about the fine print. Now, the fine print is this. Yes, they did what they said they would do. Who authorized the inquiry? Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, who is entirely and absolutely opposed to any reform in the way Australia goes to war, right? He has made that quite clear, not only when he was in opposition, but since. And in fact, just after the inquiry was announced, he made that statement yet again, that he doesn't want any change. So this inquiry is by no means a foregone conclusion. And in fact, what I anticipate will come out of it after we've all made our submissions, and I hope you're all doing so, as we have done in AWPR, what I anticipate is that they are going to do a snow job on it. We've already been told by Julian Hill, who's chairing the inquiry, good man from, Labour man from Victoria. We've already been told that some compromises will be necessary. Now, what compromises are those? The only compromise that is possible is for them to say, well, all right, maybe we'll just have a little sort of look at some proposal for war put by the executive government, and we might even have a debate on it, maybe even both houses of parliament. There's a compromise. But what they won't have is a vote. And if they don't have a vote, this is the status quo. The status quo is a debate. Yeah, that's been done before. The Senate did that over Iraq. What? And we're not taken any account of course. But the point is this: you can have a debate, and you can have what they call scrutiny. That means the parliament inquiring into the situation that is proposed. We have that already. We've got to go scrutiny and debate. That can happen anytime. The thing that makes a difference is the vote. And you will see I sadly predict that what will come out of the current inquiry is a compromise, because the subcommittee is stacked, absolutely stacked, with people who know nothing about this issue and people who know enough to hose it down. Now, what is going to come out of this inquiry, which will be, the results will be released probably early next year, around February, I think. And the submissions have to be in by the 15th of November. There will be hearings conducted. We are going there, of course, on the 9th of December. So everyone who wants to get in there should get on the website and do it now. But the main thing to concentrate on, if I may suggest it, and if you all agree, is to say a scrutiny is fine. That's what we have already. A debate is fine. We can have that already. But unless there's a vote, it makes no difference at all to the executive government doing what is already decided to do, and that is to go to war wherever we have either offered to go or the United States has told us to go. Now, this hasn't mattered so much up to now, give or take a few thousands of people dead in Iraq and Afghanistan, so on. But this time it could be China. And this is serious. This time it's serious because it involves us. It involves Australia, it involves our region, it involves the place where we all live and have to continue to live. And our obligation, clearly, as all of you who've made submissions to the IPAN inquiry have said, all of you have eloquently said it, we have to get on with our neighbors, China and everybody else, and stop allowing people elsewhere to choose who our enemies are and make us fight them. This is not the way for us to proceed, even if we thought that we could win such a fight. Now, if there were to be a war against China over Taiwan or over the South China Sea, we and our American allies would lose it. We know that because their own wargaming predicts it. American war games have looked at this time after time, as they should, and they say, we're not going to win it. So what is the alternative? They stay out of it and they make us the proxies. Us, maybe Japan, maybe South Korea, the proxies to fight China. Forget it. Just as Ukraine is the proxy in the war between the United States and Russia. We keep going on about how close we are to and indivisible from, in what it is, I've forgotten what Miles said, unchangeable from, no, anyway, you know what he said, from between us and the United States. We are absolutely stuck with it, not only with the last government, but with the current government. And so it's the work of organizations like IPAN, and maybe mine, and many others in Australia, that are the only thing that can turn this around, because we're now in an existential problem, because there are people who would like to push China back into its boundaries. We in Australia have absolutely no interest in going to war over Taiwan or the South China Sea, particularly not Taiwan, because we acknowledge, as the United States does, that Taiwan is part of mainland China. We already acknowledge that. And yet when the South Solomon Islanders say so, we go off our tree. Look, who is supposed to understand what is going on here How dumb can we get? And how can we possibly, here's my last question, how can we possibly get it through to the brainwashed Australian media that is brainwashing all of us all the time, that these are the facts? These are just the facts. A, we would lose. B, Taiwan is not our enemy. C, we don't want to defend Taiwan against China, plus we would lose. So if we want to survive, and if all of us are on the same page here, what we have to do is stop both our current opposition and our current government from following so blindly the line that we are being given by the United States. And I'm not even going to start on AUKUS. But AUKUS, of course, is a symbol, is an emblem of what it is that we're locked into. And when I talk about, just finally, when I talk about being locked in, remember how we got into Vietnam? Step by little step by little step. First of all, advisors, then some, humanitarian stuff and so on, and then in go the troops. Same thing. Same thing is happening at this moment with Ukraine, I'm afraid. And the same thing could happen in respect of Taiwan, unless we've got people who are listening, people in government who are listening to their constituencies, who are being told by people like us, don't do it. It is a loser's game. We will be sorry, just as we've been sorry for every war that we went to with the United States since Vietnam, since Korea, if you like. Enough from me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alison. I'd like to just pull out one thing in particular that you said just there, which was that that people elsewhere should not be choosing our enemies, and that that's not the way for us to proceed. I think that's a really interesting point that really speaks to this idea of Australia's own independent foreign policy and defence policy. And I just wanted to say as well, I think, the way in which Australia currently decides to go to war, as was mentioned, really facilitates that the executive makes a decision in line with the alliance as it stands. And so I think having a vote is, I think, one way to really help perhaps shift that dynamic to it to really be an evaluation of the particular circumstances, and not just is the US telling us to do so, sort of rhetoric. And I won't say any more further now. I can see that there are some questions as well, but I think we'll get to those after Bevan speaks. So I would like to introduce him to everyone. And so Bevan Ramsden is an ex-telecommunications engineer and ex-TAFE teacher, as well as a long-time peace activist and advocate for Australia's independence. As a one-time member of the coordinating committee of IPAN, the Independent Peaceful Australia Network, he assists the committee in its work, producing its monthly e-publication Voice. He was a founding member of Melbourne's independent community radio station 3CR and regularly produces programs broadcast on the station. His articles have also been published in Pearls and Irritations, Independent Australia, Green Left Weekly, and the Australian Socialist. So Bevan, I'll hand it over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Matilda, for that introduction. Thomas Jefferson, the President of the United States, in his first inaugural address in March the 4th, 1801, advocated peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Unfortunately, his country did not heed his words, nor has Australia also heeded them.
Very good.
We are entangled in an alliance with a country that former Prime Minister, the late Malcolm Fraser, has described as dangerous. In his book, Dangerous Allies, Fraser argues that Australia has become a subservient partner in this alliance, believing it desperately needs the military protection of this big and powerful ally. It is even prepared to follow its ally overseas into illegal and morally unjustifiable wars in order to maintain that protection. An alternative independent defence policy for Australia would change that position. In establishing such a policy and an independent self-defence force, the alliance with the United States would need to be managed and adjustments made. Australia would need to act independently in pursuit of the best interests of its people, whether or not that accorded with US foreign policy and US interests. Canada, for example, has done this in the past without jeopardising its close relationship with the US. Canada did not commit troops to the war in Vietnam or Iraq, as these did not involve its strategic interests. New Zealand is still in ANZUS, but does not allow US warships or those of any country into its ports unless they declare they are not carrying nuclear weapons. As US warships will not give that declaration, they are blocked from entering New Zealand ports. In Fraser's words, strategic independence does not mean ending our relationship with America and cutting our ties. It does mean having a different relationship, a more equal one, in which we can feel free to say no or offer a differing opinion. Strategic independence would allow Australia to agree or disagree with both Washington and Beijing as it suits our interests. We should not be afraid to express our views and stick to our beliefs, he said. There are at least 2 occasions in the past where Australia has done this. Emma Shortis, in her book, Our Exceptional Friend, states that Australia took the opposite position to the United States in the past by supporting the United Nations Treaty banning mining in the Antarctic, and also in opposing the apartheid regime in South Africa. So these precedents show that Australia can take an independent position within the alliance without ending it. Management of the alliance therefore involves taking decisions in the best interests of the Australian people, to safeguard our sovereignty, to promote peace, and to keep the nation out of unnecessary wars. There are those who advocate freeing ourselves completely from the US alliance, and I must confess to having been one of those. However, if we hope to have influence and credibility in advocating an independent foreign policy and self-defence force, we must take notice of the wider Australian community opinion. Lowy Institute opinion polls and IPAN's own inquiry submissions and questionnaire show 2 apparently contradictory attitudes. On the one hand, there is grave concern that the alliance with the US draws Australia into disastrous wars such as Afghanistan and Iraq, and will continue to do so. But on the other hand, it is considered to be more beneficial to stay in the alliance than to get out of it. Now, I put it to you, whether Australia stays within the US alliance or breaks out of it, there are vital decisions to be taken now in our best interests for our peace and security and that of our region. And they have to be taken irrespective of whether we upset our alliance partner. The alliance has to be flexible enough to accept that Australia's interests will not always coincide with those of the USA, and that we have the right to make those decisions which are in our best interests. Defining Australia's essential strategic interests is a starting point. For example, in the current situation which Australia faces, the advice of former Prime Minister Paul Keating should be considered. He said, Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest. Let me repeat that. Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest. We have no alliance with Taipei, none. There is no document you can find. We do not recognise it as a sovereign state. Right, end of quote. Asserting ourselves in this matter would therefore involve advising the US and the UK that Australia does not see Taiwan as an essential strategic interest, and explaining it will not become militarily involved in the defence of Taiwan and will not allow Australian territory to be used as a base or launching pad for such military operations. Now, this position has been endorsed by 900 individuals and 90 organisations Australia-wide in a recent newspaper advertisement in 2 national papers. And the Lowy Institute opinion poll taken this year found 51% of Australians do not support going to war against China. So this is not the position of a small minority. The next step to take in adjusting Australia's relationship within the alliance is to advise the US that Australia is taking steps to restructure its ADF to concentrate on territorial sovereign defence only and without foreign power assistance. This restructure includes provisioning for the role and includes reassessment of the best submarine acquisition for local coastal territorial defence. In this respect, the newspaper advertisement I mentioned called for the cancellation of nuclear-propelled submarines, which under the AUKUS trilateral military agreement with the UK and USA, would place those hunter-killer deep-water submarines in the Taiwanese Straits in support of US military actions to contain and military oppose China in asserting its rights over the Taiwanese province. As it happens, asserting a restructuring of the ADF for defence of Australia's sovereign territory is in fact in line with what the USA has frequently asked of its allies under various presidents, including Obama and Trump. They want their allies to take more of the burden, more of the financial load of the US in defending our territories, but remaining in the alliance with the United States, of course. So a move for Australia to take responsibility for its territorial defence should be understood and welcomed by the USA. However, deciding against nuclear-propelled submarines, which are designed for this long-distance hunter-killer operations, instead of finding in favour of smaller diesel-electric versions more suitable for local coastal shallow water defence, might, however, draw repercussions from the United States and the UK. But that should not deter us making a decision to cancel the acquisition of nuclear-propelled subs. On another issue, IPAN surveys show that 80% of the Australian people strongly support the signing of the United Nations Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, believing that Australia will be safer for doing so. In implementing the democratic will of the Australian people and acting independently in Australia's interests, Australian governments would therefore need to advise the United States that the Australian government will sign the TPNW and then determine what adjustments have to be made to ratify and comply with the treaty. Subsequently, the Australian government will have to advise that in ratifying and complying with the TPNW, it is giving the requisite 1-year notice to the United States that the relay ground station at Pine Gap, which provides real-time intelligence to the US Nuclear Missile Control Centre in the USA, needs to be closed down. The Northwest Cape Harold Holt Communication Station will also have to be closed to the US as they use it to communicate with their nuclear-armed submarines. Such messaging includes the capacity to send a trigger signal for launching a nuclear missile. Australian ports will have to be also closed to warships which do not declare they are not carrying nuclear weapons. Neither Australia's airports and runways would be available to aircraft that do not declare they are not carrying nuclear weapons either. And we would have to advise the US that we must remove ourselves from the protection of its so-called nuclear umbrella. There may be unfriendly consequences for such independent decisions, and may be so whether Australia is within or outside US alliance. They may draw hostile reactions from the United States, and an Australian government which had the backbone and will to make such decisions will need to prepare for backlash. We should not forget history. Some stirrings of independent thinking within the alliance occurred during the Whitlam Labor government of 1972 to 1975. Amongst other things, Whitlam queried the role of CIA operatives working at Pine Gap. The United States had already begun a campaign to destabilise his government. That's Whitlam's government. 2 days before this democratically elected government was dismissed by the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, a telegram was received by ASIO in Canberra from the CIA saying that Whitlam was a threat to the security of his own country. Sir John Kerr acted 2 days later and dismissed the Whitlam government. The United States was deeply involved in this dismissal of the Whitlam government. Now, don't say to me that's a conspiracy theory, Bevan. It's a fact. It's a fact because the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, admitted so. Whitlam made this statement in Parliament in 1977, and it is recorded in Hansard. Whitlam said, "I have been visited by an envoy of President Carter at a breakfast meeting in the Sydney Qantas Lounge. He conveyed to me an apology from President Carter for the interference in Australia's domestic politics by the United States." In my opinion, the Labor Party has never forgotten the whipping the US gave the Whitlam government. And so they walk lockstep with the Liberal coalition on defence and foreign policy to save themselves from a similar fate. In concluding, can I suggest that our task, together with many others, individuals and organisations across Australia, is to grow a movement from which will emerge the political leadership with the backbone, with the vision, with the social concern, and with the belief that Australians united and reconciled with the First Nations peoples will stand up and support them in making the decisions that have to be made for peace, security, and sustainable future. Decisions of a truly independent country, taking its place in the world as a responsible citizen. And they will do this whether we are in the alliance or out of it, and in either way, plan and prepare to weather any hostile consequences. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bevan. And I think the support for Australia to make those independent decisions exists. There are many people, you know, ourselves on this webinar, but well beyond that, would like to see Australia exert itself as an independent foreign policy actor. And I think this idea of growing a movement so that that is evident to the politicians and to the policymakers, that there needs to be then the political will invested in this as a kind of key area, is really important. I also wanted to just highlight some of what Bevan said in terms of the positive precedents that do exist, because I think we are in a situation where we are quite locked in, Australia, into this sort of alliance as it is, but there is instances where Australia has asserted itself independently before on certain policy areas, and obviously we have the other positive examples of countries that maintain an alliance with the US but aren't as maybe wholly reliant or intertwined, such as, you know, the New Zealand and Canada that Bevan cited there. So I can see that there are a couple of questions already, and if you have any questions for the speakers, now would be a good time to put them in the chat or also raise your hand and I can sort of direct that to you. But I want to start with one that's already been posed, that says here, Richard Miles has recently paid the obligatory visit to the US. There's two parts here. Do you think there has been any undue influence by the US military cabal? And secondly, if the decision to go to war does end up requiring a vote in Parliament to pass, do you think this will affect the alliance relationship? So if someone wants to chime in.
Is that for me?
I think it might have been, yes, Alison.
Okay, if Bevan would like to comment as well, of course, I'm happy. Minister Miles, even before he became minister, when he was in opposition, he made his position on all of this very clear. We went and spoke to him. We, representing Australians for War Powers Reform, went and spoke to him, and he told us quite clearly what he thought. He said that if Australia hadn't gone to war on behalf of the UK in 1939, we could have been run over by Germany. So therefore, and from that low point, we realized what we were up against. The trouble is that he is Labour's Minister for Defence, and we know what his position is on the whole idea of reforming the war powers. So what we are talking about in terms of staying out of Australia's next and most catastrophic war is getting around the defence minister. Not easy, not at all easy, because the way our laws are structured and our constitution is written, he will do whatever the Prime Minister of the day tells him to do, and that is dispatch the defence forces to wherever we or our allies want them to go. And that could happen within a very short number of years. And as I said earlier, it would result in a complete disaster for us. So where is the political support coming from, you ask? The only political support for changing this is coming from people like us. It's coming from groups like IPAN. There is a huge gap, I'm discovering, between what politicians talk about and what ordinary people like us talk about. And why they're not hearing it and why they're not being influenced by it is a mystery to me. Except that I would have to say that a huge amount of responsibility for this lack of communication has to be borne by the Murdoch media, who refuse, and so do many others, including Fairfax, Channel 9 or whatever they call themselves. They refuse to pick up this story. They refuse to report it as an issue. They refuse to say the kinds of things that we're saying to each other here about how concerned we are about this prospect. And I just hope that with what you're doing tonight and on other occasions, plus what is going to happen in November in Canberra, that we can get this voice through to people so that they understand that we know perfectly well that a war against China is a disaster, and we don't need it. The Chinese are not our enemy, in spite of what we're told, and we don't need to do what the United States tells us to do, or even worse, what we volunteer to the United States to do. And that is what I'm afraid, coming back to Defence Minister Miles, is what he has been doing. He's been in the United States, he's been talking with his counterparts there. And I'm sure that what has taken place in those discussions is they say, well, what are you up for? And he says, well, I can do this and I can do that. And he says, when? And they say, when? And they all say, right. And then we're in countdown. And I'm not just speculating. This is how it works. These things don't happen overnight. They may be claimed to be an emergency to frighten people, but they're not. They get planned years and years and years in advance. And the confrontation with China has been planned for years. And we, because of our alliance and because of people with the views that Minister Miles has, are locked into it. Now, so we're left with people like us, the public space, the civic voice, the whatever we can do to make it clear to our local members and our senators that we just don't want it. We know it will be a disaster and we don't want to have any part of it. Now, yesterday I was in Canberra and I was having this same discussion with Hugh White, who was the only person in the room, I think, who agreed with me, and he absolutely did. And what he said was, yes, completely, you're right, but don't leave it to the last minute. Hugh White said, if you leave it to the last minute when there's a crisis and when some threat has been either contrived or has manifested itself, and don't forget about the contrived ones, he said, that's too late. What we should be doing right now is letting it be clearly known to the United States that Australia is not interested in joining a coalition against China over Taiwan. And if our politicians, give or take Minister Miles, have the courage to make that known and say quietly to the United States, we aren't interested in a coalition for war in our region, then we might all survive. Otherwise, we're doomed.
I think the key to all this is still the broad mass movement, building up that movement of people that can show the opposition to the current foreign policy and impact on the political leaders that way. I mean, in the climate area, for example, the movement has had impact already on the politicians. Some lost their seats over their attitude to failing to recognise climate change as a very important issue. And it's the broad movement that impacts on the political leadership. And that's what we have to develop and strengthen and demonstrate, in my opinion.
For sure. There's quite a few more questions to cover now in the discussion. So I'm going to go ahead to this question from Ken Blackman, who commented that we need allies. So with an eye on Canada, New Zealand and Japan, with its historically strong peace camp, what countries at present have legislative control of war powers? Indeed, does the US Congress have any? So about if there's precedent for this in other kind of allied countries.
Over to you, Alison.
It doesn't really matter who our allies are. Japan at the moment is in a deep, not quite sure what word to use for it, but a deeply reactionary phase. They've got problems of their own. They are much closer to China than we are, so are the South Koreans. But their problems go back for generations. They have also got a problem because they are supposed to not go to war with anybody, and they're supposed to not have nuclear weapons. And these things are big issues for the people of Japan. Now, in the last few days, Australia has signed up with a new agreement with Japan, whose details I'm still trying to get out of the government because they haven't been announced. But it looks to me very much as though what we're signing up for is something that the United States wants both us and Japan to do. And that is, and they've wanted this for a long time, and that is, we are the ones who are going to line up and contain China, because the Americans know they can't do it. They can't and won't do it, just as they won't do it in Ukraine. They want stooges to go in there and contain China for their own reasons, which are all about, nothing about our interests or Japan interests, but all about global hegemony. Because both Biden and his predecessors, all his predecessors, cannot abide the idea of the United States not being the world hegemon. Now, there are many people in Australia who think that's a great idea and we should do whatever we can to keep that going. But in fact, the United States is a declining power in every respect except its military capacity. Declining politically, declining socially, declining economically. And it has rivals coming up, principally China. And for us to try, together with Japan, to contain China militarily, to stop that happening in its own mainland, is absolute nonsense. And it would result in a disaster for both us and Japan, for which we would be responsible and the United States would walk away, hoping that that might weaken China in some way that would then advantage the United States. Because the only thing for which the United States is in contention is world hegemony. In other words, not just military power, which they already have, but they want to call the shots everywhere, economically, ideologically, and everything else. Now, that suits some people. It doesn't suit me. It shouldn't suit most Australians because we are the proxies in this war. We are the targets against whom, if China was seriously aggravated, they would attack, because it would mean they wouldn't have to attack the United States. They could attack Australia and say, there, that's an example of what we can do. We can take out Pine Gap, we can take out Darwin, we can do whatever you like. And Australia would be totally defenseless because the United States, in spite of ANZUS, would not be interested in defending us.
All right, I might move on to the next sort of comment, I think, that is in response to the idea of the Treaty of on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and Australia supporting this, ratifying this and taking necessary steps. So it comes from Colin Mitchell, who said, good is a long-term goal, but isn't it totally unrealistic to think that our present Labor government will meddle with Pine Gap and Northwest Cape, and that therefore we should advocate more palatable baby steps? So for instance, repudiate the idea of defending Australia with nuclear weapons. We don't want that. Australia supports no first use policies for nuclear weapons, and Australia vocally supports the TPNW. I might comment on this quickly, and I think Bevan, I imagine you would also have something to add. But so my understanding is it's really key for Australia at this juncture to reject the US nuclear umbrella. Sort of regardless of the alliance, if we're really serious about supporting nuclear disarmament, then we cannot say that we rely on the use of American nuclear weapons in our defense under certain circumstances. So I think that's a key part and sort of a step here that was mentioned. I think in terms of if Australia is serious about signing and ratifying, when you ratify, you do then have to take certain steps to become compliant with the treaty. And that would include things like the relay station that Bevan mentioned that is at Pine Gap. I think some of the positive things around these steps perhaps being palatable is, as I understand, they are sort of isolated technology that could be addressed without affecting the rest of Pine Gap. And so I know there's varying views on what the shared US bases mean for Australia and the alliance and our defense policy. But in terms of isolating just that one component, my understanding is that is something that could be done and can be negotiated with the US, you know, with the view to saying, well, we're in this alliance together. However, we do have certain, you know, limits to what, you know, we believe in terms of our policy. Ergo, this is a change that needs to happen. So I think it is one of the more difficult ones, and one that could create more sort of tension, but I think it is achievable, is my understanding. Bevan, go ahead.
Yes. Well, do we believe in democracy or not? And if 80% of the Australian people believe we should sign the TPNW for our own security and safety and our region and indeed the world, then a government which takes its advice from the Australian people would have to sign that treaty, and that's what should be done now, of course. And there are consequences. I mean, Professor Richard Tanter, who's probably the best expert on Pine Gap, has said that closing the relay station would be necessary in ratifying the treaty, but he said that the Americans have alternatives to using that relay station at Pine Gap and could get around it if we gave them the appropriate notice that it would be closed down. Now that's getting into the detail, but that doesn't bypass the fact that it needs to be closed down to comply with the treaty. Now he hasn't. When I spoke to him, he said we probably would have to look at the Northwest Cape communication base, but that hasn't been discussed, I think, in the IPAN literature or document. But my understanding is that that communication base communicates with nuclear submarines and can send a trigger signal for launching nuclear missiles. So clearly, one couldn't allow the United States to continue to use that communications base in Northwest Cape. As you mentioned already, Matilda, we need to get out from underneath the nuclear umbrella. We can't rely on nuclear protection. That would be quite contrary to the spirit of the treaty. So there's no way around it. Sooner or later, a government that really is a democratic government of Australia has to have the backbone to make these decisions. I don't see the Labor Party having that backbone. I hope they do, because they promised at a national ALP conference to sign it. I don't know whether they said ratified, to sign it when they're in government. And I'm sure ICAN and others are putting pressure on the present government to come good on that. Let's hope and let's keep the pressure up.
Yes, there's actually a vote happening at the United Nations General Assembly later this week on the TPNW. So ICAN's been doing a lot of mobilising around Australia voting favourably on that resolution. So it'll be interesting to see the outcome of that. I'm looking at some more of these comments and questions, and there's actually a couple of questions about more details on the inquiry. And so I think there's kind of two simultaneous inquiries of relevance, one being IPAN's People's Inquiry into the cost of the Australia-US alliance, which has gone through its submission stage. The report is ready to go and is launching, I think, next month. And I'm sure someone from IPAN can give more details about that. And then the secondary one is the parliamentary inquiry that's currently happening on war powers. And so I guess for further information on that, we can hear from Alison, or perhaps there's some resources that we can put in the chat. I'm not sure which specifically people were asking about hearing more from, so feel free to put that in the comment if that was coming from you. I think there was a few people.
Matilda, if I could just jump in, there's a third inquiry going on. It's the Strategic Defence Review. And which some people here, including myself, have already made a submission to, and IPAN will be too. So there's three actually, and the result of that defence review will be made known in March next year, and it will involve the decision on the nuclear submarines too, as part of the current AUKUS trilateral agreement. It's quite an important time, March next year, because that's the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And it's also the time when this War Powers Reform inquiry results, I think, are coming out too.
Yeah, so there's certainly a lot happening in this space at the moment. So it's a great time to be having this discussion and mobilising. Alison, did you want to add anything about the current War Powers inquiry?
I'm not sure of what people want to hear, but I can tell them that what this is about is the whole question of whether we should be like most other modern democracies and have something written into either our constitution or a legislation that says that there have to be parliamentary discussions before the country goes to war, and that there has to be a vote in the legislature about that. And the only, if I can sort of put it this way, the only countries that aren't to some extent along that track, the sort of only democratic countries that aren't along that track are the old British Commonwealth countries, the UK itself, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And the reason that we are not is that we've all got constitutions written by the UK for its colonies, which respected the royal prerogative for war, okay? And because constitutions are hard to change, that has never happened. We have a very simple solution for changing this so that we don't have this practice anymore. And that is to simply change Section 8 of the Defence Act, which has been used several times already, to simply have the Prime Minister of the day say to the Defence Minister, I instruct you to send the troops to war. And Section 8 of the Defence Act allows that. Our Constitution allows it too. Changing the Constitution is much too hard for us, but changing Section 8 of the Defence Act is quite simple. And so what we're trying to do with my campaign is to get that kind of change approved by the current inquiry, which is ongoing right now, and have them say, yes, we think Section 8 should be changed, and then take that step by step by step through the whole procedure to get that to happen. And so therefore, I'm not 100% optimistic that we will see it in my lifetime. However, as I said before, it's people like us who make the difference on this, not the politicians, because politicians are dug into their various silos about where they stand. And it's really quite frightening in a way to look at how many of them either don't know or don't care or have got a fixed position which is exactly the same as their minister, right? And if you want to check that out, have a look at Michael West Media. And he has a series of interviews with politicians of all kinds, asking this question, should we change the war powers? And the ones who refuse to comment, quite frankly, are the majority. The ones who don't have a clue make up about the next 25%. And it is seriously depressing to read this stuff, because these people are supposed to represent us, the voters, and they don't, because we know from what IPAN has done that there are people out there with very strong and well-informed views about this matter. So we've got a hiatus between the people and the parliament, which is needing very desperately, for the reasons I've explained before, to be bridged. And that's what my little outfit is trying quite hard to do. And we will keep doing it through to March next year, except that I think that the report of the subcommittee will probably come out a bit earlier, probably in about February. But as Bevan said, March is going to be the critical time, because the Parliament will be sitting in March. It's not only the anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, it's also the report on AUKUS after its 18-month consultation is going to be before them. The result of the Defence Strategic Review is going to be there. And And Parliament should be, by that stage, deciding what to do about war powers. So March is going to be the time. And if people want to be active, I suggest not only November for IPAN, which is a good way to lead up to it, but get onto your local member before March, I suggest.
Yeah, I think that's great suggestion in terms of mobilizing on all of these issues and getting politicians involved and aware that it's coming from their constituents, and then going into Parliament at the beginning of next year into sitting and having these things kind of being presented. We have a lot other interesting comments and things to work through. So one is just a comment from Greg Bond saying the ABC have become one of the worst in terms of promoting the US alliance and denigrating any alternative point of view. Obviously, it was raised by Bevan in general, and also Alison, really, that the mainstream media is really difficult in this space in terms of just reinforcing the general kind of status quo. And yeah, I think it is a really interesting and important point that in this case, also the ABC on defence issues tends to also not leave a whole lot of scope for critical analysis or thinking. And it is those, other publications like the ones that Bevan has published in that I mentioned in his bio that do really great work in terms of unpacking some of these problems. But it is a real obstacle, I think, for the movement and for people that want change, that, the media operates in the way it does. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything or if I should move on. All right, I might move on to the next question, which was from Stephen Horn saying, any move to independence, however timid, will see us out of Five Eyes. Does this matter? Does someone want to respond to that?
I just want to say that, yes, Australia needs to have, if we have an independent foreign policy and an independent self-defence force, we need to have our own independent intelligence and information. A lot of that's through a much more developed diplomatic corps. I think Alison would support that. But we have surveillance systems, for example, the Jindalee over-the-horizon radar, developed in Australia by the CSIRO, which looks out to sea and sees a long way out, 1,000 kilometres out, see what's happening and what's on our approaches. We can also have our own satellite system downloading to our part of Pine Gap, if we wished, as a surveillance of our area. And we have to work out our own intelligence inputs. But the intelligence inputs from Five Eyes and others have not been too good in the past. Think of the Iraq War, okay? They didn't do too well there in telling us what was really happening in Iraq. And that was the reason why, well, the lies that were told helped us to get into that. So I don't have a lot of concern about the Five Eyes. I'm sure we can do quite well on our own.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bevan. I'm going to move now to an interesting point that Catherine Kelly raised, which was suggesting, I feel that we should basically ignore the US alliance per se, as it doesn't actually require us to do anything but consult, and the majority of Australians support it. We should instead try to create public debate on other aspects, such as war powers reform, our interoperability with US forces in the Northern Territory, and the revolving door of jobs in defence sector, etc. Would the speakers like to comment?
Okay, can I do that? Thank you, Catherine. These are important points that you've made, and it would be lovely if we could ignore the US alliance. Unfortunately, every government since way back has gone on and on with escalating adjectives about how indivisible, and how forever the alliance is for us, instead of doing what I have often and others have recommended, which is having at least a review of the alliance, and whether, having been signed in 1952 whether it's still up to date, whether it's still, as they say, fit for purpose. I mean, that would be a very good thing to do, but there's no movement to that. Worse than that, I have to say, in addition to what we've just been hearing, is that there's this very mysterious and alarming operation going on, an agreement between Australia and Japan for this collaboration, in which they both say that they're going to extend in some way what they are each committed to doing through their individual alliances with the United States. Now, the two treaties are quite different. What Japan has and what Australia has with the United States are quite different. I won't go into the details now, but you can look it up. And what worries me is that it's what I was referring to before, which is that the US is saying to Australia and Japan, you take this on, this is up to you, you are bonded on this stuff, and if either of you gets attacked, you've got to defend the other. That is what the current agreement, so-called, that's just come out in the last few days, looks as if it's moving towards. Now, I have just written today to Richard Marles to ask him, what does this mean? And can we please see a text? All we have at the moment is a press release, as usual. Can we please see a text about what this commits us to and what amendments to our alliances with the United States, Japan, and Australia are going to do? And when are we going to see the text on this? Because, as I said before, what the United States wants is somebody else to fight their war in this part of the world, and they're pointing at us. So it's going to be very important to get the answers. And the only way that we can make any impact is to keep onto them and notice when they're not telling us and write to them when they're not being sufficiently informative. And this is a really key one, I have to say.
I think what Catherine, what you said is pretty right, that we do need to make decisions and demand decisions be made on certain issues, and not worry about the alliance. If it offends the Americans, bad luck. We have to be prepared for that, but we haven't got a government that's prepared to take a stand or a backbone, have the backbone to make a stand at the moment. And as I've said before and repeat, that it's only the pressure from the broad mass movement of a lot of Australian people that's going to get through and make the changes, and from which a new leadership will emerge also. I think that's the key to it always.
Yeah, I've got an interesting question here I want to raise, and there was actually a comment also put in the chat in response, but it's about Australia no longer having petrol refineries nor much storage of fuel in Australia. And given that we have no means or infrastructure of supplying all of Australia with essentials, to what extent are we totally at the mercy of the US, given that we have given petrol storage to the US? And if they say they won't supply us, if we do not support their crazy insistence on a unipolar world with US as a global hegemon, what do we do? And then Shirley offered in the comments in response to Susan, public ownership of Australia's refineries and gas reserves is the most realistic and sensible alternatives, which will guarantee energy security for Australia's people.
That's absolutely correct. Privatisation and allowing foreign ownership to spread right through Australia has meant that we've lost control. Australian government's lost control of our strategic reserves and strategic industries. US ownership of the mineral industry is like take what used to be the big Australian, BHP Billiton. It's the big American. It's 73% owned by the Americans. You take the finance sector, the four major banks, including the Commonwealth, which used to be the People's Bank. The Commonwealth Bank is 63% American owned. the National, the ANZ, the Westpac, are all American owned. This foreign ownership of strategic industries, finance sector, mineral sector, and that includes the energy sector, has put us at the mercy of people in other countries. And IPAN, in discussing the need for an alternative defence policy, has also been looking at the industrial backbone that you need if you take a stand as an independent country in the world, because you have to be able to stand up to economic blockades or sanctions or whatever they like to do to manipulate your internal government and politics. You have to be able to stand on your own feet. So an assessment of the strategic industries in Australia would need to be done by an independent government, a government that espouses an independent foreign policy, to find out where is the problems. And the only way to keep control of your industries, your strategic industries, is public ownership. You can't put them in the hands of the private sector, which sooner or later becomes owned by foreign investors. So you put the finger on that one with that question. I think it's a very important part of a future independent Australia.
Great. So there's also been some comments related to, I guess, the role of public service. And so some commenting, aren't there, some strong public officials that can help us, convince the deluded politicians or something to that effect. I can't quite place it now. But also the comment that government takes its advice from the bureaucracy, i.e. chiefly defence and DFAT and associated agencies. And I suppose how this all fits in with what we're discussing. So Alison, I don't know if you want to speak to that in reaction to that.
Ask me again what the question actually is.
I suppose there was sort of a question. So one of the comments was that, don't we have some public servants like Sir Humphrey with some backbone to advise our bigoted politicians? Yeah.
Short answer, no. And I'll tell you why. The public service in my lifetime, and I worked for a long time, has now become politicized in such a way that, for instance, now the people who are advising government are the people who have given that same advice for the last 20 years, like anti-China, for instance, or pro-US alliance, for instance. And they are still there. They have built their entire career on doing this. They are not going to turn around at this moment and say, oh, I was wrong. I admit I was wrong. All along, for 20 years, I was wrong. I got promoted to this great elevation for nothing. They are not doing it. And furthermore, the ministers they speak to, in particular, Richard Marles, will not hear a different agenda from them. And if he does, he'll make sure that he doesn't hear it anymore. So when we used to talk fancifully about frank and fearless advice, I mean, I have actually seen in my lifetime frank and fearless advice given by public servants to governments, but I haven't seen it lately.
Thanks, Alison, for your kind of very candid appraisal there. I think also, at least from my experience, sort of dealing with DFAT in particular, is often they will do what they're doing unless they have a political directive that says otherwise. So unless it's come from the relevant, minister that actually this is from a political standpoint, a new policy, that sometimes is what can generate the change, but not necessarily just the advisors themselves working in a way that's different from the status quo. Just before we finish up, because we're almost at the end now, there was one question which I think in itself is a very big topic, but I think worth mentioning in the context of this discussion, which is about the global arms industry. and the role that that plays in driving this?
Well, there's no doubt that the military-industrial complex is a major lobby force in America and in Australia. And this is the mob that makes profit out of misery, out of war. And they have no moral compunction to do otherwise. And it's certainly a force. I think one of the US presidents warned about the danger of the military-industrial complex in the 1950s. Alison might remember that quote. But yeah, what else can you say? That yes, they're a very dangerous lobby.
Okay, great. I think we'll leave it there because we could talk about that for a very long time, as we could continuing this discussion. So Bevan and Alison, if you have any final comments you'd like to make, we'll wrap it up there. But before we close, I think Annette from IPAN will just say some last words as well. So to the two.
Okay, if Bevan and Alison don't want to add anything more at this stage, I'd just like to say thank you on behalf of IPAN. Thank you very much for your contributions. They've been really meaty. They've given us a lot to think about, and a lot of ideas have come out of this discussion, which I think has been really worthwhile. You know, talking about the treaty in its relation, in terms of how it affects our political and military relationship with the United States. I think the call for lobbying for a no first use of nuclear weapons, and the fact that we don't want to be part of the so-called security that comes under the umbrella of nuclear weapons, which is quite the opposite to security, because it just makes us at risk and less secure. They're all really valuable things that have come out of the discussion tonight. And I thank Matilda for doing a fabulous job facilitating this evening, and Bevan and Alison. I might just make a little bit more of a plug for the IPAN conference coming up. I'd invite you all to come to Canberra. It's going to be a great opportunity to be face to face, because that's where the real energy comes. I mean, it's great having these webinars, but the face to face interactions, the dynamic of you know, creative ideas that comes from being in a discussion in a space is quite significant and valuable. So please think about coming to the conference. Opens with a public meeting on Tuesday night, the 22nd of November, all-day conference on Wednesday. Some fabulous speakers, as I put in the chat. Also, just confirmed today, Mary Kostakidis is going to be speaking on the panel with Peter Cronau, looking at just how we make a breakthrough in not only the mainstream media, which is our real challenge, but social media as well, becoming, you know, being more effective in the way that we communicate and activate and lobby. So they're all really important aspects of the conference. We'll also be launching the report coming out of the IPAN inquiry, which was a massive undertaking, really. It's gone over a couple of years. It'll be a fantastic resource for us to use whenever we want to talk to a politician, a community leader, our friends, our neighbours. Having that in your hand, and we'll have hard copies of that available at the conference for people who come to take back with them to do just that. So please think about coming, also registering as soon as possible. So we've got an idea of numbers. You can register on the IPAN website, ipan.org.au, and I'd encourage you to do that. There's also one other upcoming event tomorrow night. IPAN is part of an international body, the International Peace Bureau, and we were asked to nominate someone to go on a panel which is talking about war and militarism, the effects and impacts on the environment, and there's some amazing speakers, including our very own Dave Sweeney. So it's tomorrow night, unfortunately a bit late because it is an international forum, 10:30 tomorrow night. And I know that Joe Camilleri also has another amazing international webinar happening tomorrow night at 11 p.m. So you get your afternoon nap tomorrow and you can stay up for these to listen to these really wonderful people that'll motivate us and for us all to get direction about where we go into the future. So again, thank you very much and have a pleasant evening. Look forward to seeing you next time, whether it's at another webinar or at the conference. Bye for now.
Thank you, Annette.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.